Chapter 5. The First Miracle. The dark enclosure of the cavern had sheltered us from the searchlights of the tribunal watchtower, but it could not protect me from the persistent, slow-turning rot inside my own head. When the moon finally dipped behind the western ridge, casting the deep limestone basin into an ocean of protective, ink-black shadow, Kalen rose from his post at the cave entrance. He did not speak to me. He merely pulled his heavy leather pack onto his shoulders, checked the straps of his gauntlets with a series of sharp, rhythmic snaps, and gestured for Ilara to lead the way out. We walked in a loose, fractured column. Ilara slipped through the mouth of the gorge like oil sliding over stone, her body a low, shifting silhouette that seemed to belong to the darkness. Kalen followed 20 paces behind her, his posture rigid, his great sword a heavy, reassuring anchor against his back. I brought up the rear. Without the active intervention of the patron, my body was an agonizingly precise ledger of physical decay. The holy hangover had settled from a violent, spasming tempest into a heavy, grinding silt that filled my joints. Every time my left boot struck the uneven shale, a sharp, white-hot needle of pain shot up through my split soul, reminding me of the mundane laws of friction and biology. My breath came in shallow, dry wheezes that tasted faintly of dust and old iron. The air around us was cool, sharp, and smelling of sun-baked stone that had rapidly lost its heat to the desert night, a completely physical, unyielding environment that demanded compliance from my fragile mortal shell. By the time the horizon began to bleed, that familiar, bruised, violet hue of a waste's dawn, we reached a small, dead grove of petrified juniper trees. The trunks were twisted into agonized spirals, their wood long ago replaced by cold, grey silicate that chimed like broken glass whenever the wind brushed against the branches. "We rest here," Kalen announced. His voice was clipped, carrying the flat, professional weight of a military order rather than the warmth of a companion. He looked at the sky, his brows drawing together. "The basin is behind us, but the terrain ahead is completely exposed. We don't move again until dusk." Ilara dropped her pack against a stone trunk, immediately pulling a whetstone from her tunic. "The wind is dying down," she muttered, her amber eyes flicking toward me before darting back to her blade. "It's too quiet out here, even for the wastes. It feels like the sky is holding its breath." "It is," I whispered, the words slipping past my parched lips before my intellect could halt them. Kalen looked at me then, a brief, piercing glance that held no anger, only a profound, hollow vigilance. "Sit down, Torin. You're swaying." I obeyed, my knees clicking like wooden gears as I slid down against a petrified root. My fingers trembled as I unbuckled the iron clasp of my leather pack. I needed an anchor. I needed something that belonged to the Torin Valerius, who had spent 20 years organizing the universe into columns of numbers and neat lines of black script. I reached past the warm, unsettling hide of the Chronicle of Oaths and pulled out my personal journal, a simple, vellum-bound ledger I had kept since my 3rd year as a junior clerk in Dawnspire. It was filled with mundane observations, weather patterns, and the meticulous tracking of ink consumption within the sanctum. It was a monument to small, harmless truths. I drew a small horn inkwell from my vest, uncorking it with my teeth. The smell of the ink, acrid, sharp, smelling of oak galls and iron vitriol, instantly flooded my senses. For a beautiful, fragile second, the world was correct. The universe was bounded by the physical parameters of the page. I dipped my bone quill into the fluid, pressed the nib to the creamy surface of the vellum, and began to write. 18th day of the transit. The canyon floor opens into a dry basin. Physical fatigue remains high. Left instep compromised by substandard footwear. Trust within the unit has deteriorated to... I stopped. The tip of my quill was still resting on the page, but the black fluid wasn't drying. It was expanding. I blinked, rubbing my eyes with the back of my hand, thinking the spots of grey static from my lingering vertigo were distorting my sight. But the ink was moving. The small, precise loops of my handwriting were beginning to fray at the edges, the delicate serifs stretching outward like the legs of a drowning insect. "Look closer, Torin," a voice murmured. It wasn't a sound. It was a sudden, freezing draft that opened up in the center of my chest, instantly driving out the acrid smell of the oak galls. The air in the grove grew thick, saturated with the overpowering, cloying sweetness of decaying white lilies and the metallic hiss of ozone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, panicked animal striking the bars of its cage. No, I thought, my fingers gripping the bone quill so hard the shaft groaned. This is my ledger. These are my words. "There are no individual words," the patron whispered, its presence expanding behind my eyes like a dark stain across silk. "There is only the sequence. Look at what you have written. See the error in the equation." The text on the page began to fold. The black lines twisted, peeling themselves off the vellum like strips of dead skin. The word fatigue dissolved into a jagged, geometric sigil that pulsed with a faint, iridescent purple light. The margins of the page, the straight red ink lines I had drawn with a brass ruler to keep my thoughts contained, snapped. They curved inward, forming a swirling, multi-layered spiral that seemed to drop away into an infinite, vertical abyss beneath the paper. I tried to pull the pen away, but my right hand refused the command. My fingers were locked into a rigid, claw-like grip, the skin over my knuckles white and translucent. I watched, a horrified spectator in my own body, as my arm began to move with a jerky, mathematical precision, dragging the quill across the page in a series of violent, concentric circles that cut deeply into the vellum. "Torin?" Kaelin's voice broke through the celestial static, but it sounded miles away, muffled by a dense, suffocating layer of dark water. I couldn't look up. My vision was completely tunneled, locked onto the journal. The inkwell on my lap erupted, the black liquid defying gravity as it rose into the air in tiny, perfectly formed octahedrons that spun on their axes before slamming into the paper. The paper wasn't absorbing them. It was becoming them. The vellum was hardening, turning into a polished, crystalline sheet of dark glass that reflected a sky filled with stars that didn't exist. "The architecture of your mind is so small," the entity chanted, its frequency rising until it vibrated behind my teeth. A beautiful, terrifying chord of dead languages. You try to build walls out of ink. You try to balance a ledger while the mountain is melting. Let the fluid run. Let the script rewrite itself. With a sudden, violent snap, the bone quill shattered in my hand, splintering into jagged white shards that bit into my palm. The pain was distant, muffled, a secondary variable that didn't matter to the calculation. From the shallow cuts in my skin, a dark, purple-tinted fluid began to ooze, dripping onto the crystalline journal and dissolving the last remnants of my human handwriting into a complex lattice of mathematical equations that defined the decay of the juniper grove around us. "Drop the book, Torin." A heavy, calloused hand slammed into my right wrist, breaking the circuit. The world slammed back into its physical dimensions with the concussive force of an iron door dropping into place. I fell forward, my forehead striking the hard, petrified stone of the root. The journal tumbled from my lap, landing face down in the dirt with a dry, mundane thud. The crystalline sheen vanished instantly, the vellum returning to its yellowed, grease-stained reality, though the pages were now covered in a chaotic, illegible bird's nest of black scratches and dark smudges of blood. The holy hangover struck before I could even draw a clean breath. A wave of cold, greasy sweat broke out across my face, the heat of the canyon sun instantly turning it into a freezing mask. My lungs felt as though they had been lined with crushed flint. Every gasping attempt to pull in air resulted in a dry, rattling cough that brought up the thick, metallic taste of copper. It was so potent, so heavy, that I had to lean over and retch into the dirt, my stomach contracting in violent, hollow spasms that left me trembling from head to toe. My right hand was completely numb, the fingers stiff and curled like the talons of a dead hawk. The fingertips were stained a deep, bruised violet, not from ink, but from the literal stagnation of my blood where the patron's energy had exited my body. "Don't touch him yet," Ilara's voice hissed from somewhere above me. "Look at the air around his hands. It's still warping." Kalen didn't listen. I felt his large hands grip my shoulders, pulling me back against the petrified trunk. He was covered in dirt, his jaw set in a hard, desperate line, his eyes scanning my face with a terrifying intensity. "Torin, breathe," he commanded, his voice tight with a mixture of panic and fury. "Look at me. Focus on my voice. You're here. You're in the grove." I am fine," I managed to lie, the words scraping against my throat like broken porcelain. I wiped my mouth with my left hand, staring down at the dark, thick blood on my palm. The ink, the script. It was changing. "There was no ink, Torin," Kalen said quietly, his grip tightening until his fingers bit through my leather sleeve. "You were sitting there with a broken stick, carving deep grooves into the leather of your own pack. Your eyes, you weren't looking at the page. You were staring through it." I forced my head up, my neck muscles cracking with a stiffness that felt ancient. The vertigo was blinding, causing the entire landscape to tilt 45 degrees to the left. I clutched at Kalen's leather bracer, my fingers weak and trembling as I tried to steady my vision. "Look at the ridge," I whispered, pointing a shaking, violet-tipped finger toward the north. Kalen turned his head, his brow furrowing. "I see the limestone cliffs, the same ones we've been tracking for 3 miles. "No," I rasped, my voice rising in a thin, feverish pitch. "Look at the angles. The rock isn't jagged, it's squared." To my human eyes, the world was a collection of natural, eroded stone. But through the lingering, greasy film of the entity's presence, the geography was glitching. The cliff face didn't descend in a natural slope. It was composed of massive, perfectly smooth obsidian steps that rose into the sky at impossible 90-degree angles. A massive watchtower, far larger than the simple tribunal posts we were avoiding, stood upon the highest tier. It wasn't built of mortar and stone. It was a towering cylinder of dark, interlocking gears that turned with a silent, terrifying velocity, grinding the low clouds into thin ribbons of grey mist. The tower was there. I could see the light reflecting off the polished bronze of its teeth. I could hear the deep, subaudible thrum of its rotation, vibrating through the soles of my boots. "It's an archive," I murmured, my eyes wide and entirely unblinking as a cold, sickening rush of dopamine flooded my brain, instantly numbing the pain in my shins. A greater repository. The tribunal didn't build this watchtower to spot scouts, Kalen. They built it to measure the decay. They are timing us. Ilara stepped into my line of sight, her face a pale mask of suspicion. She had her daggers drawn, the silver hilts catching the pale noon light. There is nothing there, Torin, just the cliffs. You're seeing ghosts. I am seeing the blueprint, I retorted, my tone suddenly shifting from the small, raspy voice of a broken cleric to that clipped, precise authority that belonged to the master of the ledgers. I stood up without using the root for support, my legs instantly rigid, my posture straight as a plumb line. The physical exhaustion was still there. I could feel the tearing of my muscles in my calves, but it was a distant variable, a metric that had been overridden by a higher logic. We are walking through a ruin that thinks it is still alive. Every rock you step on is a gear that has rusted in place. If we don't reach the abyssal gate before the rotation completes, the sequence will lock. We will be preserved here. Permanent. Stagnant. Kalen stood up slowly, his height dwarfing mine, his expression shifting from fear to a profound, hollow grief. He didn't draw his sword, but his hand remained firmly on the pommel. "You're doing it again," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You're speaking in equations, Torin. You're using the words you used right before you burned those people's wagons." "I'm trying to save your life, Kalen," I said, looking directly into his tired, shadowed eyes. Superimposed over his features, I could see those golden threads of order, delicate, thin lines that bound his heart to his vows, binding him to a city that was already a corpse. I felt a sudden, crushing wave of human love for him, a desperate desire to grab his tunic, to beg him to see what I saw, to pull him away from the structural collapse that was coming. If you stay within the old framework, you will dissolve with it. The entity isn't the monster. The entity is the only thing that can see the sky through the bars. "The entity is erasing you," Kalen said, stepping closer until his broad chest nearly touched my shoulder. He reached out, his hand hesitating, before pressing firmly against my sternum, right over my pounding heart. "I don't care about the blueprint of the world, Torin. I care about you. The man who spent 3 days in the lower sanctum helping a junior clerk who had miscalculated the grain tax so the boy wouldn't be whipped by the assessors. Where is that man?" The question was a silver spike driven through my skull. The human memory hit me with the physical force of a blow. I remembered the boy's name. Cyrus. I remembered the smell of the damp tallow candles in the lower vault, the sound of his soft, terrified sniffling as he watched the ink stain his fingers, and the meticulous, slow way I had rewritten his columns to hide his mistake from the severe, unyielding eyes of the senior tribunal. I had done it because I believed in the sanctity of mercy within the law. I had believed that the structure was meant to protect the weak, not crush them. "An error in judgment," the patron hissed, a sudden hot current of wildfire flooding my chest, instantly obliterating the memory. The boy was weak, a defective cog that should have been ejected from the sequence. By preserving him, you prolonged his stagnation. You rebuilt the cage around his neck. No! My soul screamed from its dark corner. He was a child! "Torin, talk to me," Kalen pleaded, his hand shaking against my chest. I couldn't answer. The internal tug-of-war was tearing my consciousness into separate, jagged fragments. One half of my brain was analyzing the structural integrity of the petrified juniper grove, calculating the exact angle required to unmake the stone roots and turn them into weapons if Kalen drew his blade. The other half was weeping, screaming at my fingers to relax, to drop the analytical arrogance that was isolating me from the only people who still loved me. "He's not here right now, Kalen," Ilara said, her voice sharp as she stepped between us, her amber eyes fixed on the northern horizon. She didn't look at me with horror. She looked at me with the cold, calculating eye of a hunter evaluating a dangerous, unpredictable beast. And we don't have time for a crisis of conscience. Look at the pass. From the narrow opening of the shale canyon we had just exited, a low cloud of dust was rising into the pale sky. Through the dry air, the distant metallic clink of iron-shod hooves against stone echoed down the ravine. A patrol. Radiant Tribunal cavalry. 4 riders, Ilara reported, dropping into a low crouch behind a petrified root. Light armor, but they're riding the border stallions. They're tracking the smoke from the wagon we left behind. They'll be in this grove in 5 minutes. Kaelin's military instincts took over instantly, his hand snapping the great sword from its back harness with a low, metallic shring. We hide in the deep shadows of the petrified trunks. If they pass, we let them go. If they spot us, we end it quickly. No magic, Torin. Do you hear me? If you unleash that purple fire again, you'll draw every garrison from here to the border. I understand, I rasped, my human voice returning, as the sudden tactical danger forced the entity into a temporary, watchful compliance. The abstract watchtower on the ridge faded slightly, returning to the jagged limestone cliffs, though the shadows they cast still looked unnaturally straight, like the lines of a grid drawn across the desert floor. We crouched in the absolute silence of the dead grove. The air was perfectly still, the heat of the noon sun pressing down upon our heads like a heavy brass plate. I could hear the rapid, rhythmic thump of my own heart, and beside me, the slow, controlled breathing of Kaelin as he held his massive sword ready. The riders entered the grove slowly, their horses snorting as their hooves clicked against the petrified wood. They wore the silver and white surcoats of the Radiant Tribunal, the sun catching the polished brass of their breastplates. Their lances were cradled in their stirrup cups, their expressions bored, tired, and layered with the heavy grime of the road. They were men of Dawnspire, men who had sat in the same chapels I had, men who lived by the simple, comforting belief that the law was eternal. I watched them through a gap in the stone root. A sudden, terrifying clarity washed over me. The entity didn't want to destroy them because they were enemies. It wanted to destroy them because they were similar. They were a repetition of a pattern that had already been rejected by the design. They are the same line written 4 times, the patron murmured, its presence sliding down my optic nerve until the silver surcoats of the riders began to flicker with that sickly, iridescent violet light. They are an unnecessary consumption of space. Clear the ledger, Torin. Rub out the entry. No, I thought, my fingers digging into the dirt until the dry shale tore my fingernails. They are just scouts. They have families in the lower districts. I know the man on the left. His name is Joran. His father worked the water gates. A variable named Joran, the entity chuckled, a sound like grinding tectonic plates that vibrated through my cheekbones. A variable that will report our sequence to the garrison if it survives. Look at his horse's left shoulder. The leather strap is frayed. One snap, and the variable falls. Keep your hand down, Torin, Kaelin whispered, his voice a low, warning vibration against my ear. He had noticed the way my fingers were twitching, the way the bruised violet stain under my nails was beginning to pulse with a faint, static charge. The lead rider reined in his horse just 10 paces from our position. The beast snorted, its nostrils flaring as it scented the air. It didn't smell our sweat or our leather. It smelled the sharp, artificial scent of ozone and the heavy, suffocating sweetness of decaying lilies that was leaking from my pores. Something's wrong with the air here, the rider muttered, his hand dropping to the hilt of his short sword. It smells like a temple after the candles have been snuffed. It's just the mineral crust on the stone, Joran. the second rider said, shaking his head. "Let's move on. The ravine is clear and the sun is high enough to melt our armor." Joran hesitated, his eyes scanning the petrified grove. He looked directly at the route where we were hidden. For a fraction of a second, his human eyes met mine through the gap in the stone. He didn't see the high cleric he had bowed to during the spring sanctification. He saw a shadow with two fractured, geometric pupils that glowed with a faint, hungry purple light. His breath hitched. He began to draw his blade. "There's someone. Unmake the friction," the patron commanded, a sudden, blinding surge of power exploding through my chest before my human will could even form a wall of resistance. My hand lashed out before Kalen could stop me. I didn't clamp onto the air this time. I merely flattened my palm against the surface of the petrified stone root I was leaning against. The raw, liquid purple fire didn't erupt from my hand as a blast. It flowed into the stone. The ancient, petrified wood didn't break. It responded to a higher architecture. The grey silicate root instantly dissolved its molecular bonds, turning into a swarm of thousands of perfectly square, razor-sharp black glass shards that hovered in the air for a single, terrifying beat of silence. "Solver for zero," the entity sang, its voice a deafening, beautiful frequency that filled my head with the sound of a glass tower shattering under a hammer. With an unnatural, weightless velocity, the shards tore through the air. They didn't strike the riders randomly. They moved along geometric vectors, tracing the straight lines of the grid I had seen projected across the landscape. The first rider's horse didn't scream. The black glass shards struck its harness, and the heavy leather straps didn't snap. They translated into dry grey dust that vanished into the wind. The horse collapsed forward as its center of gravity was instantly rewritten, throwing Joran from the saddle. Before he hit the ground, 3 shards of stone glass passed through his silver breastplate. The polished metal didn't deflect them. The steel softened upon contact, the iron structure unwinding into a dark, viscous liquid that poured down his tunic like oil. The shards entered his flesh, and I watched, a passenger trapped behind my own eyes, as the wound didn't bleed red. A brilliant, iridescent purple light flared from the cuts, the tissue of his chest turning translucent, revealing the white lattice of his ribs before the bones themselves dissolved into fine black soot. "Torin, stop!" Kalen roared, his great sword swinging down, not at the riders, but at my outstretched arm, trying to break the contact with the stone root. But my arm was rigid as an iron bar. The concussive force of his blade struck my shoulder, but the metal greatsword didn't cut through my leathers. The moment the steel edge entered the aura of ozone around my body, a loud, discordant chime, like a great cathedral bell cracking in half, echoed through the grove. The heavy blade of his sword warped, the straight line of the edge bending into a soft, useless wave that vibrated violently in his grip, tearing the hilt from his hands. The remaining 3 riders were already fleeing, their horses plunging through the petrified trunks in a desperate panic. But the entity wasn't finished with the calculation. I raised my left hand, my fingers tracing a clean, vertical line through the heavy air. The air before the fleeing riders fractured. A sonic boom of pure, discordant purple lightning ripped through the dead trees, leaving a jagged, smoking scar across the sky. The concussive wave struck the cliff face above the pass, and the solid limestone didn't crumble into a natural rock slide. It split along perfect cubic fracture lines. Massive blocks of stone, each one a perfect 10-foot cube, dropped from the height, slamming into the ravine floor with a series of dull, rhythmic thuds that sealed the exit completely. The riders were trapped in the basin. The black glass shards pursued them through the dust, moving with that same jerky, mathematical precision, systematically dismantling the structural lines of their armor, their mounts, and their lives until the grove was suddenly, completely silent. The violet light vanished. The entity snapped shut like a book being closed by an angry master. The withdrawal was a physical execution. My knees slammed into the dirt with a jarring shock that felt as though my kneecaps had been driven into my pelvis. The holy hangover arrived not as a gradual weight, but as an absolute, crushing collapse of my entire nervous system. The hollow, sucking vacuum in my chest exploded, my lungs turning into sacks of dry fire that refused to expand. Every rattling attempt to pull in air was a brutal, agonized negotiation with my throat, bringing up a torrent of thick, copper-flavored fluid that choked me. I fell onto my face, my cheek pressed into the cold, oil-slick mud where the petrified root had been unmade. The taste of copper was absolute, a heavy metallic weight that seemed to coat my entire mouth, my tongue feeling like a dry, heavy stone that had been soaked in old blood. My vision was a ruined ledger. The entire center of my field of view was replaced by a roaring, chaotic mass of black and grey static, leaving only the dark, blurry margins of the canyon walls visible. My right arm was completely dead, the skin of my forearm translucent and white as river ice, the fingertips a deep, permanent violet that throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. I clutched at the earth with my left hand, my body shaking in violent, uncontrollable spasms as a cold, greasy sweat drenched my clothes. I felt diminished, shrunken, a pathetic, hollowed-out husk that had dared to play host to an apex predator of the void. Don't look at me," I choked out, a wet, bloody froth escaping my lips as I tried to pull my legs toward my chest. "Kaelin, I couldn't stop the vector." The sound of boots scrambling over the loose shale was slow, hesitant, and heavy. I managed to roll onto my side, my blurry eyes tracking Kaelin's shadow as it finally fell over me. He was standing 5 paces away, his hands empty, his warped great sword lying forgotten in the dirt behind him. His face was entirely devoid of the anger he had shown before. It was blank, white, and hollowed out by an absolute, terminal horror. He looked at the smoking canyon pass, then down at the dark, purple-tinted soot that was all that remained of the men he had likely served with in the border garrisons. "Kaelin," I whispered, extending my left hand toward him, my fingers trembling like an old man's. The law was going to report us." He didn't take my hand. He stepped back, a single, deliberate pace that felt more distant than the length of the wastes. "You didn't just kill them, Torin," he said, his voice flat, completely empty of the gravity that had once grounded my mind. It was the voice of a man speaking to an executioner. "You didn't even leave them bodies to bury. You turned them into an entry you could rub out." "It was the sequence," I rasped, my intellect trying to crawl back through the copper haze to find the words to explain the geometry of what had just happened. "The patron. It saw the friction. If the patrol returned—" "I don't care about the patrol," Kaelin interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the quiet grove like a razor. He looked at his own hands, which were still vibrating from the shock of his sword being warped. "I care about the fact that you didn't even blink. When the fire took them, you looked like you were balancing a ledger. You looked like you were correcting a spelling error." He turned away from me, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his pack. He walked toward the edge of the grove, where Ilara was already gathering her gear, her movements frantic, her amber eyes wide with an absolute, uncharacteristic terror as she looked at the cubed rock slide blocking the pass. "We leave," Kaelin said to her, his voice reaching me through the dark static of my hearing. "We head into the lower gorge, the watchtower on the ridge. If it's there, it knows we're here." "And the High Cleric?" Ilara asked, her voice shaking slightly as she pointed her dagger toward my shivering frame in the dirt. Kalen didn't look back at me. He began to walk down the steep incline into the shadows of the lower canyon. If his patron can leave him his legs, he can follow. If not, let the sequence solve itself. I dragged myself up, using a petrified stump for support, my joints popping with a stiffness that felt ancient. The nausea nearly forced me back to my knees, but I stood, my fingers reaching into my bag to touch the cold, dead hide of the Chronicle of Oaths. It was inert now, its hunger satisfied by the 4 lives that had been unmade in the grove. As I took my first stumbling step down the ridge into the deepening twilight of the gorge, the low, rhythmic hum began again in the center of my skull, a soft, velvet vibration that eased the blinding headache behind my eyes and replaced my human guilt with a cold, terrifying serenity. "They are moving toward the gate, Torin," the voice whispered, completely indistinguishable from my own deepest thoughts. "They think they are running away from you. They don't understand that every step they take on this frayed earth is just another line we have already drawn for them." The taste of copper remained thick and permanent on my tongue, the absolute currency of the road ahead, where every milestone was paid for with a piece of the man I used to be.